Hello and welcome to another build video. This one's going to be to continue building my ideal DOS gaming rig with an extra machine, so here we go. Right, so this time we're going to start with the case, bit of a change, mostly because this one is pretty beat up and needs a bit of TLC before we start doing a build. So this case is another mid-tower, very similar to the other ones that I built in my DOS gaming setup, except it's got a few issues. So the first problem is on the front here there's a button missing, so I'm going to make an attempt to cast a replacement for that. And it also came with a turbo LED for the speed display, but I can't for the life of me figure out how it works. It's got a very limited number of jumpers on the back, so I suspect it's just a high-low kind of display. But all of the cables were cut when I got this case, so I haven't really any idea how to configure it, and I couldn't find any information on the internet. I had a bit of experimentation but couldn't get any sense out of it. But what I do have is a more traditional turbo LED with the 3-digit display and the normal jumpers for setting the speeds on the back. So given that this case is a bit beat up, I don't feel so bad about it, but what I'm going to do is try and file this hole in the case a little bit bigger and then try and retrofit this more sort of standard turbo speed LED into the case. Yeah, you might have noticed as well that there are actually two buttons missing on this case. That's because I took one of them off and I'm using it to make a mold to try and cast a replacement. So, get to work. I've kind of marked out the size of the new replacement LED display, and I'm just going to file away as gently as possible and hope I don't make too much of a mess of it. But let's see how it goes. So this was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be, trying to keep the thing even without having a file that's kind of exactly the width that you want, but even then it's hard not to tilt it into one corner more than the other, so you end up with an uneven level. But it does push in and I think it looks okay. I know it's not perfect, it's ever so slightly at a tilt, but it's kind of one of those things. It's like painting a house when you don't get the kind of lines in between your wall and the ceiling quite as even as you want it to, and you sit and you fret over it. But I know that I won't notice it once I start using it on a day-to-day basis. You've got to look pretty closely, so I think that's okay. So the last thing, I'm just going to pop a little bit of hot glue around the back of it just to sort of keep it in place, because it doesn't line up with the screw holes anymore. Okay, so the bits that we're going to put in the box are laid out before you. This is going to be part of the ideal DOS gaming setup that I was doing on my last video. So if you watched that, you know that I already built a 286, built a 386 and built a 486. So this is going to be the final piece in that puzzle, and this is going to be a Pentium build, but it's only going to be for DOS and Windows 3, not for Windows 95. So this is going to be a Pentium 90, and it's going to be on this board, which is a Socket 5 board. And in a way, this is the kind of final generation of processor from Intel that was around before Windows 95 came out. The original Pentiums came out a good year or so before Windows 95, I think. That was the 60 and 66 on Socket 4, and they were 5-volt Pentiums. And then Socket 5 came along, and that's a 3.3 volts, I think, and it had a series, I think it was the P54C series of processors, and there was 75 megahertz and 90 megahertz, 100 megahertz and 120 megahertz. So we're going to be building with the 90 megahertz version here. So this is kind of the last series of processors that Intel released before Windows 95 came out. So you could say that is the last generation that would have probably been released in the shops initially with DOS and Windows 3 machines, which is why it makes sense to include it in this series of DOS machines that I'm making. So we've got a nice Baby AT motherboard here, and this is from Intel. So it's based around the Intel Triton chipset, the 82438FX, and it has 4 ISA slots and 3 PCI slots. And of course Socket 5 only accepts those Pentium 54Cs, so that's only the 75, 90, 100 or 120. Though any of those processors will work with Socket 7, I believe, but we're going to keep it Socket 5. The board has 256 kilobytes of cache on board and it is capable of taking up to 128 megabytes of either fast page mode or EDO RAM. There's 4 memory sockets for that, and it's an AT board, so it's going to be an AT keyboard and an AT power supply. Got it all hooked up, put a S3 Trio in for graphics, plonked the processor in and hooked it up to a power supply, popped in a floppy drive with a Windows 98 boot disk in, and also put in 64 megabytes of EDO RAM, and we're ready to give it a boot. And boot it did, straight into the Windows 98 boot disk, and that was pretty painless. I usually have all sorts of problems before I get to this stage in a build, so it's a bit worrying. Something's bound to go wrong. So while I had all the stuff out, I thought I should get the hard drive set up as well, so I hooked that up. This is a Fujitsu 1.2 gigabyte drive, and I did run into some problems here. Nothing major, it was just a bit problematic when I was trying to format it. Fdisk let me go in and create the partition okay, but when I was trying to format it, I was getting a lot of these kind of errors, where it's saying that it was trying to recover an allocation unit, which probably means there's a lot of bad sectors on this drive, so I decided to call it a day, and I have another Fujitsu 1.2 gigabytes, so we'll try it with that. And this drive was in much better health, so the format went through pretty smoothly, no glitches at all on this one. And next thing was just shove in the DOS 6.22 disk and get DOS installed, and then at least we've got an operating system, so you don't have to worry about anything going wrong once everything's inside the case. Right, basically we've got a working system now, so we can start getting stuff into the case. So this case didn't have a power supply when I got it, so I've got a 200 watt AT supply here, and I'm going to stick that in first. Pop the motherboard tray out, and this board had standoffs attached to it already, which was nice. I think I only need one, which is good because I've only got one. There's at least one complete one. You quite often get these things where they've sliced the bottom off, where things haven't quite lined up on previous motherboard trays, but I needed one with the intact foot to slide in, and I just happen to have one. So this board is properly mounted and stable, which is good, unlike the 486 that I did last time. Right, the front of this case has a few issues in that a lot of the cables from the LEDs and switches have been cut, so I grafted some patch cables onto them and put some heat shrink around them, so that gave me a connector to go onto the headers on the motherboard. But there's another issue, well, not an issue, but an inconsistency in that the motherboard, the socket 5 motherboard, doesn't really support turbo functionality. Now, as far as I understand it, some Pentiums, early Pentiums, did support it. But turbo on those Pentiums usually means just disabling the cache in the BIOS, because the Pentium, simply the architecture of the Pentium, it doesn't turbo the way that the 386 and 486 does, so you can't just half the speed of it as such. But this motherboard has a header for a turbo LED, but not for the switch. So the switch is not going to do anything. It's not going to be connected to anything. So the button I'm manufacturing is just going to be for cosmetic purposes only. And the LED I'm going to use to light the LED itself, not the megahertz LED, but the LED that illuminates when the turbo button is pushed. So that will be on permanently, because on this machine, which probably see a bit later, is it doesn't just have LEDs, they're behind the words, little window with words, so when the hard drive activity light flashes, it actually flashes HDD, and when the turbo's on, it actually illuminates the words turbo, etc. So I think that'd be quite a nice little thing to have on all the time. But no turbo on this board, just going to be displaying the 90 megahertz and nothing else. Okay, so before the motherboard tray goes back on, I'm going to mount my drives, something I always forget to do, and then I have to take the motherboard tray back off. And also I'm going to pay specific attention this time to the other thing that I always do when I mount drives, is I usually just stick them in and then realise that they're too far away from the motherboard and the cable won't stretch, the IDE cable. So I'm going to think about it this time and place the CD-ROM close to the hard drive. I think the connector is at the top of the motherboard, so that should be cool. And then we'll put the floppy disk below the hard drive, because I nearly always put the floppy disk above the hard drive and end up running into cable length problems. There you go. On the front, you can see those words I was talking about above the buttons, which is kind of why I thought it'd be nice to have turbo illuminated all the time. Okay, so we can push the drives in from the front that need putting in. The hard drive's already in there, and I'm going to keep everything low so it's close to the motherboard, so the floppy and the CD-ROM, and then we'll just have the blank at the top. I kept on yanking off my cable extensions, so you can see them here with the heat shrink around the middle where I've grafted on a patch cable, but I managed to get them all sort of set in the end, so they're ready to go into the motherboard. So the next issue I hit was a bit of a weird one because the power switch does not fit this box. I thought all of these switches were the same size for computers, but no, the screw holes, the mounting on this is much narrower than these posts, which is pretty bloody annoying. I don't really want to start swapping PSUs at this stage since I've got so much of this put together, and I didn't really want to sort of take a switch off one of the other PSUs that I've got either, so I'm just going to make a bodge with this. I'm going to use an expansion bay plate, so I've got some that are kind of mesh, and I'm going to try and use that to create a kind of extension so I can screw this thing in. That's just going to be temporary. When I get a chance, I'll go on eBay and try and find a switch the right size. But I did actually try one of the switches on the other PSU, and while that fitted the mounting, it was too short, so the button didn't hit it. So non-standard switches, pain in the ass. So what I did was I chopped the back plate up and made a sort of bracket that extended it and just basically allowed me to screw it in a bit sort of wider than it is with its standard fitting. And now for the other thing that I always forget to do, connect the front panel connectors to the motherboard before you put it in so you can actually see what you're doing. So I can try out my new cables and get those plugged into the correct places and then get this motherboard tray mounted. Okay, so that's in, and all we have to do now is really just hook up the cables and pop a graphics card in. So got the IDE and the floppy drive cables connected, all the power plugs are in, and just need to hook up the S3 card and we're ready to give it a go. Okay, now we can fire it up and give it a test, and oh, look at that 90 megahertz shining there. Awesome. So yeah, it's only when I look at it that I can see the sort of angle on it, which will annoy me for a few days, I'm sure, but I'll soon forget about it. But apart from that, it looks pretty sweet. And it boots up and it's all working pretty smoothly, which is nice. It's been quite an easy and painless build. Just a few little niggles. And speaking of niggles, I ran into the next one straight after that. So this CD-ROM, which I thought matched the system quite well, started playing up. It was randomly failing to read, and the more I messed about with it, eventually it totally stopped reading. So I'm hoping it just needs a clean and a general bit of servicing. But in the meantime, I'm just going to pop this one out and replace it. I'm kind of running out of beige CD-ROM drives. So the one that I've got isn't ideal. It's got 32 times on the front, which I don't really like. I'd rather have a plain one, but it'll do for now. And I'll see if I can get something a bit more appropriate at a later date. Next thing, we need some sound, and I'm running out of ISA sound cards as well. Doing all these builds, I'm just using up all my stuff. So I've got Vibra C. It's just a basic sort of Sound Blaster 16. Hasn't got anything like Wave Blaster expansion or anything like that on it, so it really is basic. But it'll do for now. So we'll get that installed, and at least it'll give us some sounds to be going with. And I'll have to see about possibly upgrading this at some point as well.
8-bit testing.
So of course, now it's time to load a game and see what it sounds like. Now, I chose Grand Theft Auto and immediately ran into some graphics glitches with what I think was the S3 card. I also swapped out the monitor for a different monitor to just be sure. Now, it might have just been me, because I did notice that when you run Grand Theft Auto, you do have to run a Uni VB setup program, and I'm not sure that I did it originally with the S3. Anyway, I popped in a Mac 64, which I think actually came with this motherboard when I bought it, now that I think about it. So I'm just going to leave that in there. It's just another 2 meg card, and that one worked pretty well. So we got the game working and it sounds okay. I couldn't help notice that this game has a voodoo mode. Now, I know there were a few games, not very many pure DOS games that supported the voodoo cards, so I just had to give it a go. So I got my righteous 3D card out and stuck it in and gave it a go. Unfortunately, I just could not get this thing to work. Now, as I understand it, all you have to do is drop the OVL file into the game directory and it should work with any compatible game. But even though this game claimed to be sort of ready out of the box, it just kept on saying that it couldn't load the DLL, so I tried a few different versions but didn't get anywhere with it. Though, to be honest, I don't really want to waste a voodoo card in this machine anyway, because the DOS games were few and far between, and you can probably play them all through Windows mostly anyway, as you probably can with this, because it seems to have a 3DFX Windows installer on the CD-ROM. But it's a shame I couldn't get it working. The build isn't quite finished, but a bit earlier than is usually scheduled. I'm going to put the case badge on, so I've got a nice Pentium case badge to go on this machine, which makes the turbo LED look even more wonky. I might have to do something about that in the future, try and even it off a bit, maybe put a shimmer across the bottom or something just to make it look a bit more tidy. So all I've got to do now is wait for my resin molds to set for my turbo button and see if that works out. It's going to be clear resin, so I'm probably going to have to paint all 3 buttons. So I'm thinking about maybe a slightly darker shade of beige, but I'll be signing off now for a day or two till I finish the video. So let's see how that turns out. So it's about a day and a half later, and I cast this button in resin, and it's come out okay. It needs smoothing off. It's all very rough at the top, so I just got to work and sanded it down as close to the profile of the original as I could get it, and then popped some filler on the top and then sanded that till it was relatively smooth. So that was just a case of painting all 3 buttons so that they were the same shade, and they came out okay. Not perfect. I think what I'll actually do is end up coming back to this and smoothing them off even more, getting a better finish on them, but they're all right for now. So the 2 originals look okay, and they're back in place and work fine. So this middle turbo button is just cosmetic anyway. It's never going to get pushed because there's nothing connected to the other end on the motherboard. But yeah, they look okay. They bear anything but the closest scrutiny, I think. And that's it. It's all good to go. So all that remains now is to introduce it to the rest of the family. So they all look pretty sweet together in a line there. Got keyboards for each one, and you can see I've got some mice hooked up to the other ones now. I've got a roller ball on the 286 and a couple of serial mice on the other 2. And I couldn't find a mouse for the 486, unfortunately. I'm out of serial mice, so I'll have to do something about that. But in the meantime, I have this, and I've been looking for an excuse to do something with this. Now, this is a really cheap and nasty thing from back in the day. At least I say cheap and nasty. I had one, and I was curious about it. I was fancied having a go at computer art, so I bought this thing thinking it was kind of a pen and tablet kind of affair, but it's not really. It's a mouse that's been compacted into a pen. So it's got 2 buttons and it's got a roller ball, just the same as a normal mouse. So this is a serial affair, so we can plug this in now and give it a go and see what it's like. So it's all nicely original. It's got a floppy with drivers on it, and those drivers, I'm going to use them. They need Windows 3, so I'm going to install Windows 3 as well, which I'd planned to do on this machine anyway. So we'll see how that goes. And it didn't go very well. I installed the drivers okay, but it wouldn't detect the mouse. So this is using the Microsoft mouse driver off these discs, off this disc rather, and it just didn't register anything on the port. So I tried it with another mouse that I knew was working, and that didn't work either. So I ended up having to open up the box, and what it turned out to be was the serial connector that connects to the motherboard wasn't working, so I just swapped it out with another one, and that solved all the problems. So it's all up and running, and it's a funky little thing, so looking forward to giving this a go. Now, I was planning on testing this machine out with Grand Theft Auto, but now I need something to try this mouse, so I'm going to load up my favourite game in the world, Dune 2, and see how it works.
planet Arrakis, known as Dune. Land of sand. Home of the spice melange. The spice controls the empire. Whoever controls Dune.
I just love all of the sound in this game are just awesome. It's a lot like Blade Runner, which is my favourite film. I think that both of them are very similar in that the sound is as important as the visuals and the story, and without the sound in this game it just wouldn't have half the impact. And the same with Blade Runner, if you took Vangelis's soundtrack away and put one of your crappy orchestral soundtracks that most films have, it would just lose half of its vibe. So that's one of the reasons why I love this game so much. And messing about with this mouse pen thing, it's okay. I haven't been able to figure out how to multi-select yet. When I first started, I couldn't get the map to auto-scroll, but I figured out that was a setting in the game and sorted that out. So that was fine. It's just the multi-select. It's in the back of my head that maybe this game doesn't let you multi-select units early on, but I need to check that. If I can get it to multi-select, I think it'll be a half-decent thing to play the game with. So I'm going to live with it for a while. It's certainly quite good at navigating around windows and things, which I don't remember it being that good, but it feels quite nice. So I'm going to live with it for a while and see how it goes. And that just about wraps it up. The DOS Gaming Corner is totally complete now, well, with the exception of possibly needing another serial mouse for the Pentium 90, and also that Commodore keyboard that's on the 286 just isn't right. So I think I'll probably put that on a more recent system and get another croaky old AT keyboard to go with that. And apart from that, I've got all my DOS gaming needs covered right there. So awesome. And the crappy Apple Mac in the corner. But it's a nice little setup, this, and I'm going to use this as a permanent thing just to do all my gaming, and I'm going to try and load sort of period correct games onto each one of them and just fill the hard drives up with good period correct games and bits of other software. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed this final piece in the DOS Gaming Corner puzzle, and if you did, it'd be great if you consider giving me a thumbs up, subscribing, or leaving a comment below. And thanks very much for watching, and I hope to see you on the next video. Bye.